Welcome back. We've just finished considering the ending of the Gospel of Mark in Codex Vaticanus, and we are now taking a look at the ending of Mark in Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Sinaiticus, represented by the Hebrew letter Aleph, was produced around the year 350. On the page in which Mark 16 stops at the end of verse 8, followed by the closing title, there is no blank column. But there is something else that is very unusual. The handwriting on the sheet of parchment that contains Mark 14:54 to Luke 1:56 is not the same as the handwriting in the rest of Mark and Luke. These 4 pages were not written by the copyist who wrote the surrounding pages. Why not? Because the person who made most of the New Testament portion of Codex Sinaiticus had a supervisor, a person who proofread the pages that the other copyists made. And this supervisor disliked something that he saw. He disliked it so much that he went through the trouble of rewriting all 4 pages himself, replacing what the main copyist had written. How did Mark end on the pages that the main copyist had initially written? We do not know. But we can make some calculated guesses. With 16 columns containing Mark 14:54 to Luke 1:56, there were 10 columns at the most for the text of Mark. The main copyist normally wrote about 630 to 635 letters in each complete column of text. So in his usual handwriting, 10 columns would contain between 6,300 and 6,350 letters. If the proofreader had not made mistakes, he would have written 5,698 letters in Mark 14:54 to 16:8. With 630 letters in each column, that fills slightly more than 9 columns. Or with 635 letters in each column, that fills slightly less than 9 columns. Either way, there is not enough room for 971 more letters, so it is pretty clear that the pages that were replaced did not contain verses 9 through 20. It is possible that the main copyist finished the text at the end of verse 8, near the top of column 10. It's also possible that he finished the text in column 9, left the 10th column blank, and began writing Luke at the top of column 11. In that case, the format of the replaced pages would have resembled Codex Vaticanus. The proofreader might have decided to replace those pages in order to remove that symptom of hesitation about where the Gospel of Mark should end. Another possibility is that the proofreader made these replacement pages because he detected a major mistake in the text of Luke, involving the repetition or the omission of about 320 letters. The lettering in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 56 is extremely compact. In columns 11 through 16, each column has over 670 letters. Why was the supervisor cramming letters into those 6 columns? Well, it looks like he realized, after deciding that he had to replace those 4 pages, that the first thing to do was to make sure that the text of Luke lined up with the text on the following page. So when he began writing the text on these 4 replacement pages, he began with Luke chapter 1, verse 1 at the top of column 11. After successfully matching up the last line of text on the replacement page to the text at the beginning of the following page, he went back and wrote the text of Mark. He began writing the text of Mark by using about the normal rate of letters per column, 635 in column 1, 650 in column 2, 639 in column 3. But then he drastically compressed his lettering and put 707 letters into column 4. One of 2 things might have happened. Just maybe he might have momentarily changed his mind and decided to include verses 9 through 20. After writing 1,924 letters in columns 1, 2, and 3, he had 3,774 letters left, up to the end of chapter 16, verse 8. And there are 971 letters in Mark 69 through 20. So combined, that's 4,745 letters. If the supervisor had written the rest of Mark, including verses 9 through 20, in columns 4 through 10 at the rate of 700 letters per column, he would have reached the end of verse 20 before reaching the end of column 10. But probably, all that happened is that in column 4 he absent-mindedly reverted to the letter compression technique that he had been using in Luke. After turning the page, he realized his mistake. To ensure that he would have enough text to reach column 10, he proceeded to stretch out his lettering throughout columns 5, 6, 7, and 8. By slightly stretching out his lettering, he should have been able to easily reach column 10. But then, he accidentally skipped most of the first verse of chapter 16. Instead of throwing away the almost complete replacement pages, the supervisor resorted to stretching out his lettering very drastically in column 9. Otherwise, he would have reached the end of Mark 16:8 in that column. By placing only 552 letters in column 9, he accumulated 37 letters to place at the top of column 10. He was determined not to leave a blank column between Mark and Luke. So, it is conceivable that the supervisor considered including verses 9 through 20, and it is very possible that the pages made by the main copies contain a blank column between the end of Mark and the beginning of Luke. Not enough space to contain verses 9 through 20, but enough to express his awareness that something was missing in his exemplar. The decoration that accompanies Mark 16:8 is also pretty interesting. Milne and Skeat, two scholars who examined the Codex very thoroughly, stated in 1938 that the decorations that appear at the end of books are virtually the signatures of the copyists. The person who made the replacement pages that contain Mark 14:54 to Luke 1:56 made some other pages, including the pages where the books of Tobit, Judith, and 1 Thessalonians end. In each case, a similar decoration appears, as you can see in these three replicas. The decoration at the end of Mark resembles the decorations at the end of Tobit, Judith, and 1 Thessalonians. It also resembles a decoration that is found at the end of the book of Deuteronomy in Codex Vaticanus. But compared to the other decorations that this copyist made, the decoration at the end of Mark is more emphatic and more elaborate. Why? Maybe he just felt creative that day, or maybe he intended in this way to express his decision that the text of Mark ended with verse 8. And this would imply that he was aware of copies in which the text did not end at verse 8. Now let's consider the connection between these two codices. Practically everyone who has examined them has concluded that they were made at the same place. Some researchers have proposed that Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are two of the 50 copies that were produced for Emperor Constantine by Eusebius. However, it is unlikely that Eusebius would send Bibles to Constantinople that did not even contain the same books, and which displayed different forms of the Book of Tobit. Also, Codex Sinaiticus has the Eusebian canon numbers, but they are incomplete, and they contain many mistakes. It is unlikely that Eusebius would so badly mangle his own cross-reference system. Codex Vaticanus might have been one of the 50 copies made for Constantine, or it might have been made at Caesarea just before those 50 copies. Codex Sinaiticus was probably made there later, after Eusebius had died and Acacius had become the bishop of Caesarea. Jerome mentions in his epistle number 141 to Marcellus that because many of the papyrus copies in the library at Caesarea were wearing out, Acacius endeavored to transfer their contents onto parchment. Acacius might have been the proofreader of Codex Sinaiticus, and in his younger days he might have also been involved in the production of Codex Vaticanus. Before we look at some evidence for that, we should notice something in the book of Acts that strongly indicates that both of these manuscripts were at the same place, probably no later than the early 600s. In the book of Acts, a series of chapter numbers has been added to Codex Vaticanus and to Codex Sinaiticus. Those chapter numbers in Acts resemble part of what is known as the Euthalian apparatus, a collection of various study helps. This material is attributed in one manuscript to Pamphilus, the friend of Eusebius. Not only is this essentially the same list of chapter numbers in both manuscripts, but in 8 places a chapter number is found at the same place in both Vaticanus and in Sinaiticus, where there is no number in the ordinary Euthalian apparatus. This implies that these chapter divisions were copied into Codex B and into Codex Aleph from very similar and virtually unique exemplars, and that implies that they were both at the same place. Another important piece of evidence that connects these two manuscripts was noticed by Milne and Skeat in 1938. They observed that the handwriting of the proofreader of Codex Sinaiticus, the copyist who made the replacement pages, resembles the handwriting of Hand A of Codex Vaticanus. Both of those copyists used a fairly unusual abbreviation. They both used peculiar spelling, and the signature decorations they put at the ends of books shows a remarkable resemblance to each other. Milne and Skeat noticed that these two copyists even drew the same kinds of arrows when they wrote material in the margin. All this is efficiently accounted for if those two copyists were the same person, a copyist at the scriptorium in Caesarea. Now these pieces of evidence and more lead to the conclusion that B and Aleph both come from the same place. But why identify that place as Caesarea? For at least 4 reasons. First, 2 notes in the Old Testament state that part of the text has been checked with a second exemplar. The person who wrote those notes cited a note that was in his exemplar. It said, based on and corrected from the hexapla of origin as corrected by his own hand. Antoninus the confessor made the comparison, and I, Pamphilus, proofread the volume in the prison by the abundant favor of God. Pamphilus was martyred at Caesarea in 309. A copy made by Pamphilus is more likely to have been kept at Caesarea than anywhere else. Second, in Matthew 13:54, where the text should say that Jesus was going to his home country, Sinaiticus says instead that Jesus was going to Antipatris, a city which is not far from Caesarea. The copyist confused the Greek word Patrida with the name of a city, Antipatrida. The textual scholar J. Brindle Harris considered this the aberration of a scribe's brain as he set writing in the neighboring city of Caesarea. If we were to read a letter that said, I drank a Pensacola, where the author should have written, I drank a Pepsi-Cola, we might similarly suspect that the letter writer was located in western Florida. Also in Acts chapter 8, verse 5, the copyist wrote Caesarea instead of the correct reading, Samaria. He seems to have had Caesarea on his mind. Third, in Luke 24:13, where the normal text says that Emmaus was about 60 stadia from Jerusalem, Sinaiticus says that the distance was 160 stadia. In the early 200s, the city of Nicopolis was given a sort of official recognition as being the same place as Emmaus. Copyists far away from Nicopolis would not readily notice that the distance from Jerusalem to Nicopolis is a lot more than 60 stadia. But this almost certainly would be noticed by someone working in Caesarea, especially if that person thought of Nicopolis as Emmaus. And that person could conclude that a copyist had miscopied a number, and proceed to adjust the text by adding 100 stadia, thus writing the approximate distance from Jerusalem to Nicopolis. Fourth, even though the Eusebian canon numbers in Codex Sinaiticus are badly written and incomplete, at least it's clear that they were known when the Codex was made. So soon after their creation, they are more likely to have been known at Caesarea than anywhere else. Thus, some interesting aspects of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus become clear. Instead of being 2 independent copies, they are very closely related. They share a text of Mark descended from a text that was used in Egypt in the early 200s. They were both made at the same place, both made at about the same time. Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus both support the abrupt ending at verse 8, but their copyists appear to express their awareness of a longer form of the text. The blank space in Vaticanus indicates the copyist's knowledge of at least one copy with more text after verse 8. The replaced pages in Sinaiticus might have also had a blank column. The proofreader's stretched out lettering in column 9 shows his determination not to leave a blank column between Mark and Luke. Also, the extra elaborate signature decoration beside Mark 16 verse 8 in Sinaiticus may be an expression of that copyist's preference for that ending, thus indirectly expressing his awareness of another option. If these manuscripts were made at Caesarea, where the shorter ending was unknown, then it is very probable that verses 9 through 20 were occupying the thoughts of the copyists of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Both of these codices are in a transmission stream to which Eusebius refers. And speaking of Eusebius, we will evaluate his comments about the ending of Mark at the beginning of Part 3.